Bridget tapped her fingers on the steering wheel as she navigated the morning traffic, her eyes glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. Jonathan, her 10-year-old, was snickering beside his older sister, Penelope, who sat stiffly, her arms crossed and a scowl painted across her face. "Why don't you tell Mom about your boyfriend, Penelope?" Jonathan teased, dragging out the last word with extra venom. Penelope's eyes flashed, her cheeks reddening. "Shut up, Jonathan," Bridget sighed. The bickering had been non-stop for the last 10 minutes, and she was quickly reaching her limit. "Jonathan, cut it out," she said, trying to keep her tone even but firm. "Leave your sister alone." Jonathan ignored her, a mischievous grin creeping up. "Mom, you should see this kid. He follows her everywhere. And he's always—" "Jonathan!" Bridget's voice held more weight this time, and the boy finally quieted, though his grin never faded. Penelope huffed, turning to stare out the window, still simmering. Bridget continued to drive, the silence in the car tense but at least peaceful. Her mind, however, wasn't so quiet. As much as she tried to focus on getting her children to school, her thoughts wandered elsewhere toward the life she had shared with their father, Anthony. They had built a good life together, hadn't they? The kind people envied. Anthony had worked his way up from an ambitious young lawyer to the owner of one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. Their house was in an upscale neighborhood, their children attended the best schools, and their vacations had once been lavish escapes. But the success had come at a cost. Anthony was always working, always tied to his phone, always rushing to a meeting, always bringing home files that would consume his nights. Bridget had grown accustomed to dinners where his seat at the table remained empty. But after years of feeling second in line to his career, something had finally broken. The late nights, the missed moments, the growing sense that she and the children were not his priority. All of it built up until she couldn't take it anymore. The separation had been her decision, but it wasn't a relief. It wasn't the freedom she had imagined. She glanced at Jonathan and Penelope in the back seat. They had adjusted better than she had expected. Jonathan throwing himself into sports and friends, Penelope finding solace in her schoolwork. They were resilient. Still, Bridget wondered what they thought, how they felt beneath their brave faces. She sighed as the school building came into view. Divorce. Such a final word, and yet it felt more like a limbo. Anthony had called last night, asking if they could talk, his voice tired, but she had heard it before. Too many promises, too many last chances. Pulling up to the drop-off line, she parked the car. Jonathan was the first out, bounding toward the school without a second thought. Penelope lingered, her hand on the door handle, still gazing out the window. "Hey," Bridget said softly, reaching back to touch her daughter's arm. "Ignore him, okay? You're strong. Don't let him get to you." Penelope gave a small nod, her face still clouded. She opened the door and stepped out slowly, adjusting the straps on her backpack. "I love you, Mom," she whispered before walking away. Bridget watched as her daughter disappeared into the crowd of students. Those words hung in the air, both comforting and bittersweet. She leaned back in the driver's seat for a moment, closing her eyes. She had so much love for her kids, and she had once had so much love for Anthony, too. But love wasn't enough anymore. They were two lives now, moving in separate directions, and Bridget was just trying to find her footing. With a deep breath, she started the engine again and pulled away from the school, unsure of where she was really headed, but knowing, for the first time, she'd have to figure it out on her own. Bridget stood in the lobby, staring at the illuminated elevator numbers as they descended slowly. The soft hum of the building surrounded her, but it did nothing to quiet the anxious thrum in her chest. She had been here 100 times before, in this same lobby, back when things were normal, back when she would bring the kids by to meet Anthony for lunch, or pick him up after a late night. But today, everything felt different. The elevator doors slid open, and she stepped inside, pressing the button for the 5th floor. As the doors closed, her reflection in the mirrored wall stared back at her, pensive, tired, yet determined. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her blouse as the elevator began its slow ascent. Dot. Each floor that passed felt like a countdown to something she both dreaded and needed. She hadn't seen Anthony in person for weeks. Hadn't heard his voice outside of formal phone calls or brief texts about the children. There had been moments, late at night, where she almost reached out, almost let the familiar pull of him draw her back into the life they once shared. But she resisted. Today was about severing the last ties. Dot. Her heart thudded as the elevator reached the 5th floor, the doors sliding open with a soft chime. She stepped out into the quiet hallway, her heels clicking against the polished floors as she approached the meeting room. The door was slightly ajar and she could already hear low voices inside. Dot. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. There he was, Anthony. His back was to her at first, but as she moved deeper into the room he turned, and their eyes met. For a moment, everything else faded away. He looked the same, tall, composed, his dark hair still neatly in place, though there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A weariness, maybe. Or was it regret? Bridget felt her stomach twist. She had thought this would be easier, that the distance they'd created over the past few months would make this meeting just another formality. But seeing him now, after everything, stirred something deep inside her, a sadness for the love they had lost. Bridget, Anthony said quietly, his voice soft but tense. She nodded, unable to trust herself to speak. Her lawyer, seated at the table, motioned for her to sit, and she did so, smoothing her skirt and taking a deep breath. Dot. Anthony's lawyer cleared his throat, diving straight into business. All right, let's go over the division of assets. He pulled out a stack of papers, setting them down with a heavy thud. We've outlined a preliminary agreement for the property, financial holdings, and custody arrangements. Anthony's firm, of course, will remain his. But there's the matter of the— She can have it all, Anthony interrupted suddenly, his voice sharp and cutting through the room. Dot. The room fell silent. Bridget blinked, caught off guard by the declaration. Her lawyer glanced at her with a raised brow, while Anthony's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Dot. Anthony, the lawyer said, his voice low and careful, you need to think about this. We're talking about a significant portion of your assets. The house, the accounts, everything. I don't care, Anthony said firmly, his eyes never leaving Bridget. She can have it all. Bridget felt her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't the man she expected to face today. The man who always fought, always negotiated, always planned his next move with precision. This Anthony, sitting across from her, looked defeated. Broken, even. She wanted to say something, to break the silence that seemed to stretch too long, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just looked at him, and for the first time in months, he truly looked back at her. It was as if they were standing on opposite sides of a canyon, both knowing they couldn't reach each other, but still lingering at the edge. Dot. Their lawyers exchanged quiet murmurs, but Bridget barely heard them. She couldn't take her eyes off Anthony. She saw the pain in his face, the exhaustion in the way his shoulders sagged, and for a fleeting second she wondered if things could have been different. If he had fought for her the way he fought for his clients. If they could have saved what was lost. Dot. But it was too late now. She swallowed hard and finally looked away, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the pen on the table. Her lawyer handed her the agreement, and as she scanned the words, all she could think was how final it all felt. Across from her, Anthony remained silent, watching her. He had offered her everything, and yet it felt like neither of them had won anything at all. Bridget sank deeper into the warm bathwater, letting the heat soak into her skin, her muscles finally starting to loosen after the tension of the day. She stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying the moment she had left the meeting. Her hand hovered over the pen, ready to sign the papers, but then something inside her had stopped. She couldn't do it. Not yet. Dot. I need more time, she had said, standing abruptly, her voice barely steady. Both lawyers had exchanged glances, and Anthony had simply nodded, his expression unreadable. But she knew. He had understood before she even said the words. He had always been able to read her like that, even in the silence between them. Dot. Bridget closed her eyes, sinking further into the bath until the water lapped at her chin. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a candle she'd lit earlier, and the quiet allowed her thoughts to swirl freely. Dot. Anthony had offered her everything. The house, the accounts, the material life they had built together. But none of that mattered. She didn't want any of it, not really. All she had ever wanted was him. His time. The moments where he would set his phone down, forget about the case he was working on, and just be with her and the kids. The family dinners where his seat wouldn't be empty. The nights where he would hold her in the dark, and they'd talk about everything and nothing, like they used to. Dot. She lifted her hand out of the water, watching droplets trail down her skin, the weight of her regrets pressing heavily on her chest. Maybe she hadn't made the right decision. Maybe asking for the separation had been more about her anger than what she really needed. Dot. Her phone buzzed from the counter, jolting her out of her thoughts. She glanced over at it, but made no move to get out of the bath. It was probably Anthony. She could feel it. He'd want to talk, to ask her what more time really meant. Dot. Bridget closed her eyes again, letting the phone buzz until it stopped. She couldn't face him, not right now. She was too tired, too tangled in her own confusion. Dot. After what felt like an hour, she finally rose from the bath, wrapping a towel around herself and walking slowly into the bedroom. The house was quiet, the kids at her mother's for the night, and the silence felt heavy. She slipped into bed, pulling the covers over her, and stared at the ceiling again, willing sleep to come. Dot. But as soon as her eyes fluttered closed, her phone rang again. This time it startled her from the edge of sleep, and in her dazed state she reached for it, answering without checking who it was. Hello. Her voice was groggy, thick with sleep. Dot. There was a pause on the other end, and then, quietly, Bridge. Her heart skipped at the sound of his voice. She hadn't expected him to call again, and hearing him now, the way he said her name, made something deep inside her ache. Anthony, she whispered, sitting up in bed, the blanket falling from her shoulders. Dot. For a moment there was just silence between them, the quiet hum of the connection, the only thing filling the space. Dot. He began, but stopped. Bridget could almost picture him, sitting in his study, his fingers rubbing the bridge of his nose like they always did when he was thinking too hard. Dot. She swallowed, her throat suddenly tight. I couldn't sign it, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Dot. I know, he said softly. Her eyes filled with tears, and she wiped at them angrily, not wanting to cry, not now. But it was all too much months of hurt and frustration, love and loss, all rising to the surface. Dot. I don't want all of it, she said, her voice cracking. I never did. I know, Anthony repeated, his voice heavy with emotion. I thought giving you everything would make it easier. Make things right. Bridget shook her head, even though he couldn't see her. I didn't want things, Anthony. I wanted you. Your time. Our time. You and me, and the kids. That's all I ever wanted. There was another long pause, and she could hear him exhale on the other end, the weight of what she had said sinking in. Dot. I know I screwed up, Bridget, he said finally, his voice thick. I put everything else before you. Before us. I didn't see it until it was too late. Her heart squeezed painfully in her chest. She had spent months convincing herself that she could live without him, that their life together was over. But now, hearing the regret in his voice, she wasn't so sure. She didn't respond, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know what to say. The words that needed to be said were too tangled in her mind, too raw and messy. Bridge, he said again, softer this time, as if he was trying to hold on to something fragile. Please, let's talk. Really talk. Her eyes closed, a tear slipping down her cheek as she pressed the phone closer to her ear, caught in a storm of emotions she couldn't fully process. Part of her wanted to hang up, to protect herself from the pain of hope. But another part, the part that had never stopped loving him, wanted to listen, to hear what he had to say. Weeks had passed since that late-night phone call, and life for Bridget had slowly begun to shift. The morning she decided to give her marriage another shot was still fresh in her mind. It wasn't a decision made lightly, but Anthony's words had struck something deep inside her, his promise to change, to prioritize her and the kids over everything else. She had been skeptical at first, but there was a sincerity in his voice that she hadn't heard in years. He had told her about his decision to step back from the law firm, handing over most of his responsibilities to his partners while still keeping a stake in the company. He'd still be involved, but only in a minor way, doing a few consultations here and there, nothing that would consume his time the way it used to. The terms of their new beginning, however, were hers to set. Bridget had made that clear. I want us to take this slow, she had told him, her voice steady as she laid down her expectations. Show me you can be present. Show me you're serious. And you're gonna be there for Jonathan's games, Penelope's activities. For them. She had paused, meeting his eyes across the table. I'm not letting you move back in yet, not until I know for sure this is real. Anthony had agreed without hesitation. He didn't argue, didn't push back. He wanted his family back, and for once, he wasn't trying to control the situation. Now, weeks later, Bridget found herself cautiously optimistic. They had gone on a few dates, simple ones, nothing grandiose like the lavish dinners he used to take her on when they were first married. This time, it was about reconnecting. A walk in the park, dinner at a small restaurant in the neighborhood, even grabbing coffee together after dropping the kids off at school. There were no distractions, no work calls interrupting their time. Just the two of them, talking, laughing, even. Slowly, the old connection began to reawaken. Anthony had been true to his word so far. He showed up at every one of Jonathan's soccer games, cheering from the sidelines, sometimes quieter than the other parents, but still there. It meant everything to Jonathan, who had started to open up to him again after weeks of keeping his distance. Penelope, too, had softened. Bridget had noticed the way her daughter would glance at her father, a small smile tugging at her lips when he asked about her day. The kids were adjusting, cautiously optimistic like she was, but Bridget knew they were still guarded. They had seen him drift away before, and they were waiting to see if he would stay this time. One Friday evening, they were sitting in the bleachers at Jonathan's game, the autumn air cool and crisp around them. Bridget sat next to Anthony, but they weren't touching. Not yet. It was part of her boundaries, part of the slow process she needed. Jonathan scored a goal, and Anthony jumped up, cheering louder than she expected. It caught her by surprise, and she smiled despite herself. When he sat back down, their eyes met, and she saw it again, that sincerity, that quiet promise that he was really trying. Not bad, huh? He said softly, glancing back at the field, his voice full of pride. Not bad at all, she replied, her smile lingering. Later that evening, after they had dropped the kids off at her mom's house for a sleepover, Bridget and Anthony found themselves walking through the neighborhood, the sky darkening into twilight. It was quiet between them, but it wasn't the strained silence that had defined so many of their recent years. This was different. Easier. Thank you for coming to the game, she said, breaking the silence. It meant a lot to Jonathan. Anthony nodded. I wouldn't miss it for the world. He hesitated, then added, I should have been there more before. Bridget looked at him, seeing the weight of his regret etched in his face. She could tell he meant it. You're here now, she said softly. They walked for a while longer, and when they reached her front door, she paused, turning to him. This was always the hardest part, the part where she sent him away for the night, reminding herself that this slow pace was necessary. For both of them. Good night, Anthony, she said, her hand resting on the door. He nodded, a soft smile on his lips. Good night, Bridget. I'll see you tomorrow. Yeah, she said, a small smile pulling at her lips. I'll see you tomorrow. As she watched him walk away, Bridget felt a mixture of emotions. This was the beginning of something new. She wasn't naive. There were still obstacles to overcome, trust to rebuild, and old wounds to heal. But for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. This wasn't about going back to what they had before. It was about building something better, something stronger. And for now, that was enough. As Anthony Mercedes disappeared into the quiet evening, Bridget felt a sudden pull deep in her chest. Without thinking, she reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed his number. "Anthony," she said when he picked up, her voice soft, almost shy. I saved you a slice of apple pie. Your favorite." There was a pause, and then she heard him chuckle, that familiar sound she hadn't realized she missed so much. "I'll be right there." She hung up the phone and stood by the door, her heart racing. She didn't know what had possessed her to call him back, but as she stood there, waiting for him, she could feel something shifting inside her. It wasn't just the pie. It was him. The way he had been showing up for her, for their kids. The way he had tried to rebuild what had been broken. Within minutes he was back at her door, his eyes lit with surprise and curiosity as he stepped inside. "You really saved me a slice?" he asked, though his gaze held more than just the thought of pie. "Yeah," she said, biting her lower lip. But there was something else in her eyes, something she knew he saw too. That flicker of desire that had been buried for so long between them, now suddenly reignited. He stepped closer, and she could smell the faint cologne that clung to him, mixed with the crisp autumn air from outside. Her body responded instinctively, and memories of their early days together rushed through her mind. Back when they couldn't keep their hands off each other, back when their nights were filled with passion and laughter. Without another word, Bridget closed the distance between them. She could feel the heat between them now, simmering just beneath the surface. She wanted him, wanted what they used to have, that electric connection that seemed to light her up from the inside out. Before she could overthink it, she reached for his belt, her hands working quickly to undo it, her breath catching in her throat. Anthony's eyes darkened with lust, but he stayed still, letting her take the lead. It was something she had always loved about him, the way he let her have control when she needed it. She dropped to her knees in front of him, her fingers brushing against his skin as she pulled his pants down. He exhaled sharply, his body tensing, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the soft rustling of clothes and their ragged breathing. Bridget didn't hesitate. She wanted him to feel her, to know that despite everything they had been through, this part of them was still alive. As she took him into her mouth, she could feel his hands gently gripping her hair, his low moan filling the air. "Bridget Victoria Snyder," he gasped, barely audible. "Baby Bridge." It had been so long, too long, and yet it all felt so familiar, so right. When she finally pulled away, her eyes met his, and without a word he bent down and kissed her, and then lifted her to her feet. His hands were on her now, moving with a hunger she had almost forgotten he had for her. He guided her to the couch, and before she knew it, his lips and tongue moved against her center in ways that made her gasp, her body vibrated in response. It was like being taken back in time, back to the days when they couldn't keep their hands off each other, when the pull between them was irresistible. She had missed this, missed him, and in that moment nothing else existed but the two of them. They moved to the floor, their bodies entwined, and as they made love, it was as if the months of distance, of pain, of silence, melted away. Bridget could feel him, really feel him, his breath hot against her skin, his hands gripping her in all the places that made her feel alive. Every kiss, every touch felt like a promise, a reminder of the life they had once shared, the love that had brought them together in the first place. When it was over, they lay there, tangled in each other, their bodies still warm from the heat of their passion. Bridget's head rested on Anthony's chest, his arms wrapped tightly around her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt whole. They didn't speak. There was no need to. The quiet was comforting, filled with a sense of peace that she hadn't realized she had been craving. Anthony's fingers lazily traced circles on her back, and she closed her eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Bridget knew this wasn't a fix for everything. They still had a long road ahead. But as she lay in his arms, the familiar scent of him enveloping her, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe they could rebuild this. Maybe they could find their way back to each other. Not just through the bedroom, but through the everyday moments of life. For now, though, she let herself simply exist in this moment, feeling his warmth, his presence, and knowing that, at least for tonight, they had found their way back to each other.